The reason your mind won't be at peace is not what you think. Right when you finally lie down to rest, your mind begins to work against you. The more you try to quiet it, the louder it becomes. Why does this happen? This video won't force your mind to be silent, but it may help you finally understand it and gently let it rest. You've probably felt this before. A day where nothing was really wrong. You finished your work. You spoke with people you care about. Nothing terrible happened. And yet, later that night, you find yourself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Your body is still. The room is quiet, but your mind begins to move. A conversation from earlier in the day reappears. A small moment suddenly feels heavier than it should. Then something older returns. A memory from years ago, as something you thought you had already let go of. And then, without warning, your mind drifts forward, imagining what might go wrong tomorrow, creating problems that don't even exist yet. Have you ever noticed how strange this is? Nothing is actually happening, and yet inside, it feels like something is. It almost feels as if the mind is quietly turning a peaceful moment into something heavy. It starts with small questions. Did I say the wrong thing? What if this goes wrong? Why did that happen the way it did? And before you even realize it, something inside begins to tighten. Your body is safe in bed, but your mind is no longer there. It is moving through the past, rewriting moments. It is moving into the future, trying to control what hasn't happened. And suddenly, a quiet night becomes a storm of thoughts. But here is something most people never stop to notice. The discomfort you feel is not always coming from what actually happened, and it is coming from the way the mind keeps telling the story. We often believe our suffering comes from life itself, from difficult situations, other people, uncertainty, and sometimes that is true. But what if the deeper source is much quieter than that? What if it begins inside the mind itself? A single thought appears, then another follows, and slowly, those thoughts form a story that feels completely real. The body reacts, emotions rise, and without realizing it, you are no longer just experiencing life, you are experiencing the mind's version of it. In Buddhist wisdom, this understanding is simple, but deeply transformative. The mind is a powerful storyteller, but not every story it tells is true. Sometimes it exaggerates. Sometimes it clings to the past. Sometimes it creates futures that may never come. And when we believe every thought without seeing it clearly, the mind quietly creates suffering where there was none before. But there is something gentle hidden in this realization. Because the moment you begin to notice your thoughts, not fighting them, not trying to push them away, but simply observing, something begins to change. A small space appears between you and the voice of the mind. And in that space, something unexpected begins to emerge. A sense of calm. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because you are no longer carried away by every thought that passes through you. Peace was never truly gone. It was simply hidden. And in this video, we're going to gently explore this together, not as something complicated, but as a quiet, honest way of understanding the mind and how learning to see it clearly can slowly guide you back to something you may have been searching for all along. A peaceful mind. Kankin, the mind never stops talking. But there is something about the mind that most people rarely notice. Even when the world becomes quiet, the mind keeps speaking. If you pay close attention, you may begin to hear it, not as an external voice, but as a constant inner commentary that quietly follows you throughout the day. The moment you wake up, it begins. It comments on what you need to do, what might go wrong, what you should have said yesterday, what you hope will happen tomorrow. And the strange part is that it rarely pauses. Earlier, we reflected on how suffering often begins quietly inside the mind. Life itself may be relatively calm, yet the mind continues moving, interpreting, replaying, predicting. It is almost as if there is a narrator living inside us, constantly describing everything that happens. You walk into a meeting, and the mind whispers, "What if I say something wrong?" You see someone glance at you, and the mind wonders, "Did they judge me?" You remember a moment from years ago, and suddenly the mind says, "I should have done that differently." It analyzes, it compares, it judges, and most of the time, we never question it. In fact, we grow up believing that this voice in our head is simply who we are. We assume that every thought that appears must be important, must be meaningful, must somehow represent reality. But have you ever noticed how quickly the mind forms conclusions? A small situation happens, and the mind immediately builds a story around it. Sometimes the story is accurate, but very often it is only an interpretation, a mixture of memory, fear, and imagination. Imagine a quiet evening after a long day. You finally sit down, maybe with a cup of tea, hoping to relax. The room is peaceful. The outside world is calm. Yet inside your mind, and something else begins unfolding. The mind replays a conversation from earlier. Why did they say that? Did they mean something else? Maybe I sounded foolish? Then another thought appears. What if tomorrow becomes difficult? What if things don't work out the way I hope? Before long, what started as a peaceful moment slowly turns into tension. Your body tightens, your breathing becomes shallow, and suddenly you feel restless without fully understanding why. Nothing has actually happened in that moment, yet the mind has already created a storm. This is the quiet power of the thinking mind. In Buddhist teachings, this constant activity of the mind is not seen as something abnormal. It is simply the natural movement of an unobserved mind. A mind that has never been trained to notice itself. The mind produces thoughts the way clouds form in the sky. It is simply what the mind does. But the problem does not come from the appearance of thoughts. Thoughts themselves are not the enemy. And the difficulty begins when we unconsciously believe every single thought that appears. Because the mind does not only observe reality, it interprets it. It exaggerates. It imagines. It compares your life with someone else's life. It measures your progress against invisible standards. It revisits old memories and paints them with regret. And the more we follow these thoughts without awareness, the louder they seem to become. Think about how many thoughts appear in a single day. Thousands. Most of them repetitive. The same worries, the same doubts, the same small judgments about ourselves and others. Like a radio that never completely turns off, the mind continues broadcasting commentary from morning until night. And yet, most people rarely stop to ask a very simple question. Are all of these thoughts actually true? This question alone can change everything. Because when you begin to observe the mind carefully, something surprising becomes clear. Many thoughts appear automatically, and they arise from habit, from old experiences, from fears that were learned long ago. They are not carefully chosen. They simply appear. In that sense, the mind is not very different from a storyteller who never stops speaking. Sometimes the story is helpful. Sometimes it is creative. But sometimes it also creates unnecessary suffering. A single thought can color your entire day. One moment of self-doubt can quietly influence how you see yourself for hours. A small criticism can echo in the mind far longer than it deserves. But if you look closely, you may begin to notice something important. There is a difference between you and the voice that speaks inside your mind. You are the one who can notice it. Imagine sitting quietly near a lake in the early morning. The surface of the water moves gently as the wind passes. Small ripples appear and disappear. If the wind becomes stronger, the water becomes more restless. But beneath the surface, the lake itself remains. And in many ways, the mind works the same way. Thoughts are like the ripples on the surface. They appear, they move, they fade away. Yet most of the time, we become so fascinated by the ripples that we forget the stillness beneath them. And when we forget that stillness, the mind begins to feel overwhelming. But something subtle begins to change the moment we simply notice the voice of the mind without immediately believing it. Instead of saying, "This thought must be true," we begin to say, "Ah, this is just a thought," a small shift, but a powerful one. Because when a thought is seen clearly as a thought, it loses some of its power to control us. The mind may still speak. It may still produce commentary, judgments, and worries. That is its nature. But slowly, gently, we begin to see that we are not the voice. We are the awareness that hears it, and that quiet realization is often the first doorway to a much deeper peace. 2. When thoughts become stories. But here is something subtle that happens inside the mind. Something so quiet that most people never notice it. A single thought appears, and before we realize it, that thought has already become a story. In the previous reflection, we began to notice how the mind never truly stops speaking. There is always a quiet inner voice commenting on what happens, analyzing moments, replaying conversations, imagining what others might think. But something even more interesting begins to happen after that first thought appears. The mind doesn't simply observe an event, it interprets it. And once interpretation begins, a story slowly starts forming. Think about how many times this has happened in ordinary life. Someone says something brief during a conversation. Perhaps their tone feels a little distant. Maybe they respond with fewer words than usual. The moment passes quickly. On the outside, it seems small, almost insignificant. But inside the mind, something begins to unfold. The mind whispers, "Did they mean something by that?" Then another thought follows. Maybe they're upset with me. And before long, the story becomes clearer in the mind. Maybe I said something wrong. Nothing dramatic has actually happened in that moment. The event itself was simple, maybe even neutral. Yet the mind quietly begins building meaning around it, layer by layer. And strangely, the story often feels completely real. You may notice this especially in the quiet moments of the day. Perhaps you are driving home from work, sitting alone in the car while the road stretches ahead. The mind returns to something that happened earlier. A small comment, a quick glance, a brief silence in a conversation. And suddenly the mind begins rewriting the moment again and again, and each time adding a little more emotion, a little more interpretation. By the time the mind finishes the story, what was once a tiny moment now feels heavy with meaning. But have you ever wondered how often these stories are actually true? Or how often they are simply the mind trying to make sense of uncertainty? The human mind has a deep desire to understand everything. It wants explanations. It wants clarity. When something feels unclear, the mind often fills in the missing pieces on its own. Sometimes those interpretations are helpful, but many times they quietly create unnecessary suffering. Imagine someone who made a small mistake at work earlier in the day. Maybe they forgot to send an email. Maybe they said something awkward during a meeting. The moment itself lasts only a few seconds, but later that night, the mind returns to it. Why did I do that? Everyone must think I'm incompetent. I always mess things up. Notice how quickly the story grows into what began as a simple mistake slowly transforms into something much larger, a narrative about personal failure. And the more the mind repeats this story, the more convincing it becomes. But if you look closely, the suffering is no longer coming from the original event. It is coming from the story the mind keeps telling about it. This is one of the quiet insights found in Buddhist wisdom. Much of human suffering does not come directly from what happens to us. It comes from the meanings the mind attaches to those events. The mind remembers the past, interprets it, reshapes it, and then presents the story back to us as if it were absolute truth. But is it? Think again about that quiet lake we imagined earlier. When the surface of the water becomes disturbed, the reflections begin to change. The trees along the shore may appear distorted. The sky may look broken in the ripples, yet nothing in the real landscape has actually changed. Only the surface of the water has moved. The mind works in a similar way. When thoughts become agitated, the stories we tell ourselves begin to distort our perception of reality. A neutral moment begins to feel personal. A temporary problem begins to feel permanent. And the longer we stay inside the story, the more convincing it becomes. Many people spend years living inside these silent narratives. Stories about who they are. Stories about what others think of them. Stories about why the future will not work out. But have you ever paused and asked yourself something very simple? What if the story is not the truth? What if it is only a thought, repeating itself? There is a quiet freedom hidden inside that question. Because the moment we begin to see the story as a story, something loosens inside the mind. The grip of the narrative begins to soften. The emotional weight begins to lighten. The event itself may still have happened, but the suffering created by the story slowly begins to fade. Imagine again that person sitting quietly at night. The room dim, the world calm around them. The mind begins replaying a moment from earlier in the day. But this time, instead of immediately believing the story, they pause. They simply notice the thought, "Ah, this is the mind creating a story again." And in that small moment of awareness, the story loses some of its power. It becomes just another passing thought, like a cloud drifting slowly across the sky. And once we begin to see this clearly, another question naturally arises. If so much suffering comes from the stories we tell ourselves, what might happen if we slowly learned to let those stories go? 3. The habit of holding on. But there is another quiet habit of the mind that many people begin to notice only after watching their thoughts carefully. The mind does not only create stories, it also holds on to them. In the previous reflection, we explored how a single thought can slowly grow into a narrative inside the mind. A simple event becomes a story, and that story begins shaping how we feel. But something even more interesting happens after that. Even when the moment has already passed, the mind keeps returning to it. Have you ever noticed how easily the mind replays certain memories? You might be walking down the street, cooking dinner, or sitting quietly in the evening. Nothing in the present moment is troubling. Yet suddenly, the mind brings back something that happened long ago. A mistake you made, and an awkward moment in a conversation. A time when someone said something that hurt you. And as the memory returns, the emotions quietly return with it. The body tightens slightly. The heart feels a little heavier. And for a brief moment, it almost feels as if the past is happening again. But in reality, nothing from that moment is happening anymore. The event is gone. Only the memory remains. Yet the mind continues to hold it close, almost as if it refuses to let the moment disappear. Many people experience this, especially late at night. The day is finally over. The house grows quiet. The lights dim, and the world outside becomes still. It should be a peaceful moment. But this is often when the mind becomes most active. The same memory appears again, the same conversation, the same regret. Why did I say that? I should have handled that differently. If only I had done something else. The mind circles around the memory again and again, almost like a hand repeatedly touching a wound that has already begun to heal. And strangely, the more we revisit the memory, the stronger the feeling becomes. But have you ever wondered why the mind does this? Why does it cling so tightly to painful moments? Why do difficult memories seem to return more often than peaceful ones? You may have noticed something curious about the human mind. A kind word from someone may brighten your day, but it often fades quickly from memory. Yet a single criticism can stay in the mind for years. One uncomfortable moment can echo in the mind far longer than dozens of happy ones. This is not a personal flaw. It is simply one of the natural tendencies of the human mind. The mind is designed to remember what feels threatening, painful, or uncomfortable. Long ago, this tendency helped human beings survive. Remembering danger helped our ancestors avoid harm. But in modern life, this same habit often causes unnecessary suffering. And because the mind continues replaying experiences that are no longer happening. In Buddhist wisdom, this habit of the mind is often described as attachment. Not only attachment to pleasant things, but also attachment to painful experiences. The mind becomes attached to its own memories. It holds on to moments that have already passed. Imagine again that quiet lake we reflected on earlier. When something falls into the water, ripples spread across the surface. After some time, if nothing disturbs the lake again, the water naturally becomes still. But now imagine someone standing by the shore, repeatedly throwing small stones into the water, again and again. The lake never has the chance to settle. In many ways, the mind behaves in the same way. A painful moment happens once in real life, but the mind throws the memory back into awareness over and over again, creating new ripples each time. The event happened only once, but the mind relives it dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. And so, the suffering continues long after the moment itself has passed. Think about the person we imagined earlier, sitting quietly at night, the room dim, the outside world silent. The mind brings back a moment from years ago, perhaps something embarrassing, perhaps something painful. For a moment, it feels vivid again. But if that person pauses and looks carefully, something surprising becomes clear. The memory is not actually happening now. It is only a thought appearing in the present moment, just a mental image, just a story returning. And in that realization, something begins to soften. Because the moment we recognize that the past is only appearing as a thought right now, the grip of the memory begins to loosen. The mind may still bring the memory back from time to time. That is natural. Habits of the mind do not disappear instantly, but the way we relate to those memories can slowly change. And instead of following the memory deeper into regret, we simply notice it. Instead of repeating the story again, we allow the thought to pass, like a leaf floating gently down a stream. Have you ever tried simply observing a memory without entering the story? Just watching it appear, and then watching it fade? If you do, you may discover something very quiet and very freeing. Memories cannot trap us unless we continue holding on to them. And the moment we loosen that grip, even slightly, the mind begins to feel lighter, not because the past has changed, but because we are no longer carrying it the same way. And in that small moment of release, the mind takes its first step towards something deeper. A mind that does not cling so tightly slowly begins to rediscover peace. 4. The illusion that thinking solves everything. But there is another quiet illusion the mind often creates, and many people live with it for years without realizing it. The belief that if we just think about something long enough, we will eventually solve it. At first, this belief seems reasonable. After all, thinking helps us plan, reflect, and understand the world. But somewhere along the way, the mind quietly crosses a line. What begins as reflection slowly turns into something else: endless thinking. Earlier, we noticed how the mind holds on to memories and keeps replaying the past. But now another pattern appears. The mind not only returns to old moments, it tries to fix them through thinking. Have you ever noticed this happening late at night? The house is quiet, the lights are dim. You lie down hoping to rest. But instead of settling, The mind begins searching for answers. It replays conversations again. Why did that happen? What should I do differently next time? What if something goes wrong tomorrow? The mind keeps turning the situation over and over, as if examining every angle will somehow bring relief. And for a while, it feels like progress. Thinking feels productive. It gives the impression that we are doing something important, something necessary. But after a while, something strange begins to happen. The same thoughts start repeating. The same worries circle back again. And instead of feeling clearer, the mind begins to feel heavier. You may recognize this feeling. That quiet exhaustion that comes from thinking too much. The body is tired, but the mind refuses to stop. The same question loops again and again, like a song stuck on repeat. And yet, the answer never quite arrives. This is the subtle trap of overthinking. And the mind convinces us that more thinking will eventually solve the problem. But most of the time, it is not solving anything at all. It is simply repeating the worry. Imagine someone sitting alone in their living room after a long day. The room is silent, except for the faint sound of a clock ticking on the wall. Earlier that day, something uncertain happened at work. Perhaps a project did not go as planned, or someone seemed dissatisfied. Now the mind begins its work. What if I lose this opportunity? What if I made a terrible mistake? What will happen next? The mind begins constructing possible futures, one after another, each more dramatic than the last. Hours pass. The person sits in the same chair, staring into the quiet room while the mind runs through scenario after scenario. But notice something important. None of those imagined futures are actually happening. They exist only inside the mind. Yet the body reacts as if they are real. The shoulders tense. The heart beats faster. Anxiety quietly fills the room. The suffering does not come from reality. It comes from the mind trying to control reality through endless thinking. In Buddhist wisdom, there is a gentle recognition about this habit of the mind. The mind believes it can solve uncertainty by thinking harder, but life itself cannot always be solved this way. Some answers do not appear through more thought. They appear through stillness. This does not mean thinking is useless. Thought can help us learn, plan, and reflect. But beyond a certain point, thinking becomes like stirring water that has already begun to settle. The more we stir it, the more unclear the water becomes. Imagine again the quiet lake we have been reflecting on throughout this journey. When the water is disturbed, the reflection of the sky becomes distorted. The more movement there is on the surface, the harder it becomes to see clearly beneath it. But when the wind softens, when the surface becomes calm, the water naturally clears. Clarity does not come from forcing the lake to be still. It comes from allowing the disturbance to settle. The same is true for the human mind. Sometimes the understanding we seek appears only when the mind stops struggling to find it. Have you ever experienced this before? Perhaps you spent hours thinking about a difficult problem with no solution in sight. But then, the moment you stepped away, taking a walk, resting quietly, or simply letting the mind breathe, the answer appeared naturally. Not because you forced it, but because the mind finally relaxed. This is one of the quiet lessons found in Buddhist practice. Peace does not come from controlling every thought, and wisdom does not come from thinking endlessly. Sometimes the mind becomes clearer the moment it stops trying so hard. Now imagine again the person sitting alone in that quiet room, the clock still ticking softly in the background. The mind begins to repeat its worries again. But this time, instead of chasing the thoughts deeper, the person pauses. They take a slow breath. They notice the thoughts passing through the mind. And instead of following them, they allow them to drift by. Nothing dramatic happens in that moment, but something subtle shifts. The mind no longer feels trapped inside the problem. A little space appears, and in that small space, the body relaxes, the breath slows, and the mind begins to soften. Perhaps this is where many people begin to discover something surprising. Not every problem needs more thinking. Sometimes what the mind truly needs is quiet. And from that quiet, a deeper understanding slowly begins to emerge. 5. How the mind creates suffering. But there is a deeper layer to all of this that many people only begin to see after watching their mind carefully. Thoughts do not simply appear and disappear. They create feelings, and those feelings quietly create even more thoughts. In the previous reflection, we began to see how the mind often believes that thinking harder will solve our problems. Yet the more we chase those thoughts, the more restless the mind becomes. But something even more powerful is happening beneath the surface. A single thought can change the way the entire body feels. Have you ever noticed how quickly your mood can shift because of just one thought? You might be having a peaceful moment, perhaps walking outside on a quiet afternoon or sitting alone with a warm drink. Nothing disturbing is happening in that moment, and the air feels calm. The day is ordinary. Then, suddenly, a thought appears. Maybe it is a memory. Maybe it is a worry about the future. Maybe it is a doubt about yourself. And almost instantly, something changes inside the body. The chest tightens slightly. The stomach feels uneasy. The breath becomes shallow. A quiet tension begins to spread through the body. Nothing in the outside world has changed. Yet inside, everything feels different. This is one of the most subtle ways the mind creates suffering. A thought appears, and the body responds. But the story does not end there. Because once the feeling appears, the mind begins reacting to that feeling as well. Imagine someone sitting quietly late in the evening, perhaps in the same quiet room we have been returning to throughout this reflection. The room is dim. The outside world is calm. A single thought appears in their mind. What if things don't work out in the future? Immediately, a feeling of worry arises, and then the mind reacts to that worry. Why am I always so anxious? Something must be wrong with me. That new thought creates even more tension. The feeling becomes stronger, and then another thought appears. What if my life never becomes stable? Now the mind is no longer responding to reality. It is responding to its own chain of thoughts and emotions, and slowly, a loop begins to form. A thought creates a feeling. The feeling creates another thought. That thought deepens the feeling. And before long, the mind feels completely caught inside the cycle. Many people know this experience very well, especially during moments of stress or uncertainty. One small worry appears in the mind, and suddenly, the entire future begins to look dark and overwhelming. Yet, if we pause and look carefully, something important becomes clear. The suffering did not begin with the future. It began with a single thought about the future. This is one of the profound insights found in Buddhist wisdom. And the Buddha often spoke about how suffering does not arise only from what happens in life. Difficult events may occur. Loss, change, uncertainty. These are natural parts of human existence, but much of our suffering grows from how the mind reacts to those events. Two people can experience the same situation and feel very different levels of suffering. One person may struggle deeply, while another remains relatively calm. Why? Because their relationship to their thoughts is different. Imagine again the quiet lake we have been reflecting on throughout this journey. When a small stone falls into the water, ripples spread across the surface. If the water remains undisturbed afterward, the ripples gradually fade. But now imagine the wind beginning to blow across the lake. The ripples become waves. The waves disturb the surface even more. The water becomes restless. In many ways, thoughts and emotions interact like this. A single thought is like the first ripple, and the emotional reaction is like the wind. And when the mind continues reacting to both, the surface of the mind becomes increasingly disturbed. Yet beneath the surface of the lake, something important remains unchanged. The depth of the water stays still. In the same way, beneath all the movement of thoughts and emotions, there is a deeper awareness within us that remains quiet. But most of the time, we are so focused on the ripples that we forget the depth. Have you ever noticed how quickly a simple worry can grow when the mind keeps feeding it? A person receives a short message from someone they care about. The message seems brief. The mind begins wondering, why was it so short? Did I do something wrong? A small uneasiness appears. Then, the mind begins building more thoughts. Maybe they're upset with me. Maybe the relationship is changing. Soon, the emotional weight becomes real, even though the situation itself may be completely ordinary. And this is how the mind quietly builds suffering, not through one single thought, but through a chain of thoughts reacting to each other. But something very important begins to change the moment we see this process clearly. When we notice that thoughts create feelings, and feelings create more thoughts, the cycle becomes visible. And once a cycle becomes visible, it no longer has the same power, because awareness interrupts the loop. Instead of immediately reacting to the next thought, we pause. Instead of believing the next fear, we observe it. Imagine again the person sitting in that quiet room at night. The same thought appears. What if the future becomes difficult? But this time, they notice it. They feel the slight tension in the body. They recognize the beginning of the loop. And instead of feeding it with another anxious thought, they take a slow breath. They allow the feeling to be there without adding another story. For a moment, the mind becomes still, and the ripple fades, and the lake slowly begins to settle again. Perhaps this is the quiet wisdom hidden inside the teachings of the Buddha. Suffering does not grow simply because thoughts appear. It grows when the mind keeps reacting to every thought without awareness. But when awareness enters the moment, the cycle begins to soften. Thoughts may still come. Feelings may still arise. But the mind no longer has to be carried away by them. And in that gentle pause between thought and reaction, something very peaceful begins to appear. A mind that is no longer trapped in its own storms slowly begins to remember its natural calm. 6. Seeing thoughts instead of believing them. But there comes a quiet moment in this journey when something begins to shift inside the mind. A small realization appears, and it changes the way we see our thoughts forever. In the previous reflection, we explored how suffering often grows from a loop between thoughts and emotions. A single worry can create a feeling, and that feeling can give birth to more thoughts. The mind becomes trapped in its own storm. But what if there is another way to relate to those thoughts? What if the mind does not need to follow every thought that appears? Most people spend their lives believing their thoughts automatically. A thought appears, and without noticing it, we immediately treat it as truth. I'm not good enough. Things will probably go wrong. They must be disappointed in me. The thought appears, and we believe it. But one of the most powerful discoveries in mindfulness and in Buddhist wisdom begins with a very simple moment. The moment you realize, this is just a thought. At first, this realization may seem small, almost insignificant, but in truth, it changes everything. Because the moment you recognize a thought as a thought, something subtle happens. A space appears. Before that moment, the thought and your sense of self were almost the same thing. If the mind said something negative, it felt like reality. If the mind predicted something frightening, it felt as if danger was already present. But when you pause and simply notice the thought, the relationship changes. Instead of being inside the thought, you are now observing it. Imagine again the person we have been quietly following throughout these reflections, sitting alone in the evening, the room dim, the outside world calm. The mind begins its usual movement. A familiar thought appears. Now, what if the future becomes difficult? For years, that thought might have immediately pulled them into worry. The mind would begin building scenarios, imagining problems, predicting outcomes that may never come. But tonight, something is different. They pause, they notice the thought, and gently, almost with curiosity, they say to themselves, "Ah, this is a thought." In that small moment, something remarkable happens. The thought is still there, but it no longer feels as powerful. It is no longer an unquestioned truth. It becomes something lighter, something passing through the mind rather than defining it. This is the beginning of mindfulness, not forcing the mind to be silent, not fighting against thoughts, but simply learning to see them. In Buddhist practice, awareness is often described as a quiet observer, like someone sitting by the side of a road, watching cars pass by without stepping into traffic. The cars represent thoughts. They come and go. Some move quickly. Others linger. Some are pleasant, others uncomfortable. But the observer does not chase them and does not try to stop them. They simply watch. Most of the time, however, we do the opposite. A thought passes through the mind and we jump directly into it. We ride along with it wherever it goes. If the thought is anxious, we travel into anxiety. If it is regretful, we revisit the past again and again. But mindfulness introduces another possibility. You can stay on the side of the road. You can watch the thoughts without becoming them. Have you ever tried this in a quiet moment? Perhaps you are sitting alone, breathing slowly, noticing what appears in your mind. A thought arrives. Instead of reacting immediately, you simply acknowledge it, thinking, and then you return to the breath. Another thought appears, planning. Again, you notice it gently and let it pass. At first, the mind may still feel busy. Thoughts will continue appearing, just as clouds continue to drift across the sky. But gradually, something interesting begins to happen. The thoughts lose their urgency. They still arise, but they no longer control the entire atmosphere of the mind. It is similar to watching clouds move across a wide blue sky. Some clouds are large and dark. Others are small and light. But the sky itself remains open and untouched. The thoughts are the clouds. Your awareness is the sky. And when you begin to see thoughts from this perspective, their power slowly fades. Imagine again the quiet lake we have returned to throughout this journey. Earlier, we saw how the mind can become disturbed by ripples of thought and emotion. But when awareness appears, it is as if someone steps back from the edge of the water. Instead of throwing stones into the lake, they simply observe the surface. The ripples appear and fade. The water gradually becomes calm again. In the same way, when you stop feeding every thought with more thinking, the mind slowly begins to settle. Not because thoughts disappear completely, but because you are no longer carried away by them. Have you ever noticed that some thoughts lose their strength the moment you observe them clearly? A fear appears, but when you watch it closely, it begins to dissolve. A self-critical thought arises, but when you recognize it as only a thought, it no longer defines who you are. This is the quiet power of awareness. It creates space, and within that space, the mind can finally rest. The person sitting in that quiet room may still have thoughts about the future. Memories may still appear. The mind may still speak from time to time, but something has changed. They are no longer trapped inside every thought that arises. They can see it. They can watch it. They can let it pass. And in that gentle distance between awareness and thought, something very peaceful begins to grow. A mind that once felt crowded and restless slowly begins to breathe again. And from that quiet space, a deeper stillness begins to reveal itself, one that has always been there beneath the movement of thought. 7. The space between thoughts. But there is something even more subtle that begins to reveal itself once we learn to observe our thoughts. Something most people overlook their entire lives. Between every thought, there is a space. In the previous reflection, we explored what happens when we begin to see thoughts instead of automatically believing them. That simple awareness creates distance between us and the constant voice of the mind. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer control the entire inner world. And when that distance grows just a little, something very quiet becomes noticeable. Not another thought, but the absence of one. Have you ever paused long enough to notice what happens after a thought fades? For most people, the mind moves so quickly that this moment passes almost unnoticed. One thought disappears, and another immediately takes its place. The stream of thinking feels continuous, like a river that never stops flowing. But if you sit quietly and watch the mind carefully, you may begin to notice something surprising. There are tiny gaps between the thoughts, small, almost invisible pauses. And within those pauses, there is silence. Earlier, we imagined the mind as a lake whose surface becomes disturbed by ripples of thought and emotion. When we chase thoughts, more ripples appear. When we react to them, the water becomes restless. But when we simply observe without interfering, the surface slowly begins to settle. And when the water becomes still enough, something beautiful appears. Clarity. The same is true within the mind. Between the ripples of thinking, there is always a deeper stillness waiting quietly underneath. Most people never experience this stillness because the mind is constantly moving. And thoughts follow one another so quickly that the silence in between becomes almost impossible to notice. But the moment we slow down and observe the mind gently, those spaces begin to appear. Imagine someone sitting quietly in the evening after a long day. The room is dim, the air calm, perhaps the faint sound of distant traffic moving softly outside the window. They close their eyes and begin to notice their breath. At first, the mind continues its usual activity. Thoughts about work, thoughts about conversations from earlier in the day, plans for tomorrow. The mind jumps from one idea to the next, just as it always has. But instead of chasing the thoughts, they simply watch them. A thought appears, then it fades. For a brief moment, nothing. Then another thought arrives. But now something interesting becomes noticeable. Between those thoughts, there was a tiny moment of quiet. Just a second, maybe even less. But it was there. And within that small moment, the mind was completely still. No worries, no memories, no stories. Just awareness. Have you ever noticed this before? That brief moment after a thought disappears, when the mind feels open and spacious? It is a moment many people overlook, because the next thought quickly arrives and pulls attention away again. But if we begin to pay attention to these small gaps, something remarkable happens. The gaps slowly become wider, not because we force the mind to stop thinking, but because we stop feeding the endless chain of thoughts. When attention gently returns to the breath, the mind naturally begins to soften. One breath, another breath, and slowly, the spaces between thoughts begin to grow. Those spaces are not empty in a negative sense. They are deeply restful. In those quiet pauses, the mind is no longer struggling with the past or worrying about the future. It is simply present. In Buddhist practice, this quiet space is often described as the natural resting place of the mind. Peace is not something we have to create, and it is something that is already there, beneath the noise of constant thinking. Imagine clouds slowly drifting across the sky. When the clouds are thick and heavy, the sky seems hidden, but the sky itself never disappears. It remains wide and open above the clouds. In the same way, thoughts move across the mind like clouds passing through the sky of awareness, and the quiet space between them is like a glimpse of that open sky. The more we become familiar with that space, the more natural it begins to feel. Imagine again the person sitting quietly in that dim room at night. At first, the mind was full of movement. Thoughts appeared one after another. But now something has changed. A thought arises, and passes. There is a pause. Another thought appears and fades. Again, a pause. The pauses are becoming longer now, and within those moments of silence, the body begins to relax. The breath becomes deeper and slower. Yet the tension that once filled the mind begins to dissolve. Nothing dramatic has happened. No problem has been solved. No future has been secured. And yet, something inside feels lighter, because the mind has finally discovered a place where it can rest. Have you ever noticed that the mind does not actually need constant thinking in order to exist? Just like the lake does not need endless ripples to be alive, sometimes the most natural state of the mind is simply quiet awareness. And the more familiar we become with the space between thoughts, the more we begin to realize something profound. Peace was never something far away. It was never something we had to chase or achieve. It was quietly present all along, waiting beneath the movement of the mind, hidden in the gentle space between one thought and the next. 8. Letting thoughts pass like clouds. But there is one gentle lesson that many people only begin to understand after they notice the space between their thoughts. You don't actually have to fight your thoughts. You don't even have to stop them. You only need to let them pass. In the previous reflection, we began to notice the quiet spaces between thoughts, those small moments of stillness that appear when the mind is no longer rushing from one idea to another. And when those spaces appear, something important becomes clearer. Thoughts are not permanent. They arise and they fade. But for most of our lives, we treat thoughts as if they must be controlled. When a pleasant thought appears, we try to hold on to it. When a painful thought arises, we immediately try to push it away. We struggle with the mind as if it were an opponent. Yet this struggle often creates even more noise inside. Imagine again the person sitting quietly in that dim room at night, the same quiet space we have returned to throughout this reflection. The room is calm. Outside, the world has softened into evening silence. But inside the mind, a familiar thought appears. What if tomorrow becomes difficult? For many people, this moment triggers an immediate reaction. The mind begins searching for answers, resisting the thought, or trying to replace it with something more positive. I shouldn't be thinking this way. Why can't I stop worrying? But strangely, the more we fight a thought, the stronger it seems to become. Have you ever noticed that trying to force a thought away often makes it return even more strongly? It is like trying to push a beach ball under the surface of the water. The harder you push, the more pressure builds beneath the surface. And eventually, the ball pops back up with even more force. The mind behaves in a very similar way. When we resist a thought, we give it energy. When we chase it, we give it attention. But there is another way to relate to the movement of the mind. Instead of pushing thoughts away or clinging to them, we simply allow them to move through awareness. This is where one of the most beautiful metaphors in Buddhist practice appears. Thoughts are like clouds drifting across the sky. Some clouds are light and soft. Others are dark and heavy. Some move quickly. Others linger for a while. But no matter what kind of cloud appears, the sky itself does not struggle against it. The sky does not chase the clouds. The sky does not resist them. It simply allows them to pass. In the same way, awareness can hold our thoughts without needing to control them. Imagine watching the sky on a quiet afternoon. A large cloud slowly drifts across the blue. For a moment, it blocks the sunlight. The world becomes slightly dimmer, but you do not panic. You know the cloud will move, and eventually the sky becomes clear again. Now imagine the mind working in the same way. A thought appears. Perhaps it is a worry about the future. Perhaps it is a memory from the past. Perhaps it is a moment of self-doubt. For a moment, that thought may feel heavy, like a dark cloud passing across the sky of the mind. But if you simply watch it, without chasing it, without resisting it, something surprising begins to happen. The thought slowly moves on its own. it fades. Another thought may appear, and then it too passes. Have you ever noticed how even your strongest thoughts eventually disappear if you stop feeding them? Every thought has a natural life cycle. It arises, it lingers briefly, and then it dissolves. The problem is not the cloud itself. The problem begins when we chase the cloud across the sky, trying to hold it or push it away. In Buddhist teachings, this gentle approach is often described as non-attachment. Non-attachment does not mean suppressing thoughts or pretending they are not there. It simply means allowing them to exist without clinging to them. Imagine again the quiet room where our familiar observer sits in the evening. A thought appears in the mind. What if I fail in the future? But instead of reacting immediately, they notice the thought with quiet curiosity. Ah, a worrying thought. They take a slow breath. They watch it. And like a cloud drifting across the sky, the thought begins to move on. Nothing dramatic happens. No internal battle. No struggle. Just movement. And with each thought that passes without resistance, the mind becomes a little lighter, a little more spacious. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped arguing with your own thoughts? What if you allowed them to move freely through the mind, the same way clouds move through the sky? The sky is never harmed by the clouds that pass through it. And in the same way, awareness is never harmed by the thoughts that arise within it. Thoughts come, thoughts go, but the quiet presence that observes them remains steady and open. And the more we trust this natural movement of the mind, the less we feel the need to control every thought that appears. The person sitting in that quiet room may still experience thoughts from time to time. Memories may drift by. Worries may briefly appear. But something important has changed. They no longer chase every cloud. They simply watch the sky. And in that simple act of letting thoughts pass, the mind slowly discovers something it had forgotten for a very long time: the gentle freedom of letting go. 9. The freedom of not believing every thought. But there is a quiet freedom that begins to appear the moment we stop believing every thought that passes through the mind. Not by force, not by suppressing the mind, but simply by seeing thoughts for what they truly are. In the previous reflection, we explored how thoughts can move through the mind like clouds drifting across the sky. They arise, they linger for a moment, and eventually they pass. When we stop fighting them and simply allow them to move, the mind begins to feel lighter. And slowly, something deeper begins to change. We no longer assume that every thought is telling the truth. For most of our lives, we grow up believing the voice inside our mind without question. If the mind says something critical, we assume it must be correct. If the mind predicts something frightening, we assume danger is already approaching. But what happens when that belief begins to soften? What happens when we pause and gently ask ourselves a simple question? Is this thought necessarily true? At first, this question may feel unusual. The mind is so accustomed to being believed that questioning it feels unfamiliar. But once we begin to look closely, we discover something surprising. Many of our thoughts are simply habits, old patterns repeating themselves, stories that the mind has practiced telling for years. Imagine again the person sitting quietly in that familiar room at night. The same place where the mind once replayed worries about the future and regrets about the past. A thought appears again, just as it always has. I might fail at this. In the past, that thought would immediately trigger tension. The body would tighten. The mind would begin constructing scenarios of everything that could go wrong. But now something is different. Instead of accepting the thought automatically, the person pauses. They notice the thought, and gently, almost with curiosity, they recognize this is only a thought. The moment that realization appears, something subtle shifts inside. The thought loses some of its weight. It is no longer a prediction carved into reality. It becomes something softer, something less absolute, simply one possibility among many. Have you ever noticed how quickly the mind reacts to small situations during the day? A brief comment from someone can trigger self-doubt. A delayed response to a message can create worry. A minor mistake can suddenly feel like a personal failure. But when we begin to see thoughts clearly, those reactions start to change. Instead of immediately believing the story the mind creates, we pause. Someone says something slightly critical. The mind whispers, "They must think poorly of me." But instead of accepting the thought instantly, we notice it. And suddenly, the moment feels different. The situation is still there, but the mind is no longer trapped inside its interpretation. This is where a quiet kind of freedom begins to appear. Because when we stop believing every thought, the mind becomes less reactive. Small events no longer grow into emotional storms. The mind begins to feel spacious. Imagine someone walking through a busy city street. People move in every direction. Cars pass by, conversations drift through the air. In the past, every small interaction might have triggered a reaction inside the mind. A stranger's expression, a passing comment, a brief misunderstanding. Each moment would spark another chain of thoughts. But now something has changed. Thoughts still appear. That is natural. But they no longer control the entire experience. A critical thought may arise, but instead of clinging to it, the mind allows it to pass. A worry about the future may appear, but it is seen simply as a passing cloud. And because the mind is no longer constantly reacting, something unexpected happens. Life begins to feel lighter. The same situations still occur. Challenges still arise. Conversations still unfold with all their unpredictability. But the mind is no longer amplifying every moment into unnecessary suffering. The person who once felt overwhelmed by their own thoughts now moves through the day with a quieter mind. Not because the world has become easier, but because the mind is no longer believing every story it creates. Have you ever wondered how much emotional energy we spend reacting to thoughts that are not even true? How many moments of peace are lost simply because we believe the first story the mind tells us? When we begin to question those stories gently, the mind begins to loosen its grip. A mistake becomes just a moment, not a lifelong failure. A criticism becomes just a comment, not a judgment of our entire worth. A worry about the future becomes simply a thought passing through awareness. And with each moment of recognition, the mind becomes a little calmer, a little more open, a little more peaceful. Imagine again that quiet room at night where this journey began. The same place where the mind once spun endless worries about tomorrow. Now the room is just as still. Thoughts still appear from time to time, but they pass more easily now. The mind no longer feels like a crowded room full of voices arguing with one another. It feels more like an open sky. Thoughts drift through, but they do not stay for long. And in that openness, something very simple begins to grow. A quiet sense of ease. The kind of ease that comes not from controlling life, but from no longer believing every thought about it. 10. Returning to the present moment. But there is one place where the mind cannot trap us with its stories. One place where regret about the past and fear about the future lose their power. And that place is always available, right here in the present moment. Throughout this journey, we have slowly watched the movement of the mind. We saw how thoughts can become stories, how memories can be replayed again and again, and how worries about the future can create storms inside the mind. We noticed how believing every thought can quietly create suffering. But now a gentle question begins to appear. If the past exists only as memory, and the future exists only as imagination, then where is life actually happening? Only here, only now. Yet strangely, the present moment is where the mind spends the least amount of time. And many people move through their day physically present, but mentally somewhere else. While working, the mind worries about tomorrow. While resting, The mind replays yesterday. While speaking with someone, the mind is already thinking about what comes next. The body stands in the present, but the mind wanders endlessly through time. Have you ever noticed how rarely we actually experience a moment exactly as it is? Imagine someone walking through a quiet park on an early morning. The air is cool, the sky soft with the first light of the day. Leaves move gently in the wind. Birds call from somewhere in the distance. Everything in that moment is calm. But the mind may be somewhere else entirely. What do I need to finish later today? What if the meeting tomorrow doesn't go well? Why did that conversation yesterday feel so uncomfortable? The beauty of the moment quietly passes by, unnoticed. This is one of the subtle ways the mind pulls us away from peace. Not because the present moment lacks peace, but because the mind rarely stays there long enough to experience it. In Buddhist practice, returning to the present moment is often described as returning home. Because the present moment is the only place where life is actually unfolding. The past cannot be changed here. The future cannot be controlled here. But something else becomes possible here: peace. Imagine again the person sitting quietly in that familiar room at night. The room is dim, the outside world calm, just as we have seen many times throughout this reflection. Thoughts may still appear occasionally. A memory from earlier in the day, a small worry about tomorrow. But this time, instead of following the thoughts, the person gently brings their attention somewhere very simple, to the breath. The breath moving in, the breath moving out. At first, it may seem almost too simple. The mind is used to complicated problems and endless analysis. Paying attention to the breath feels almost insignificant. But slowly, something begins to change. Each breath brings attention back to the present moment. The mind may wander again, as it always does. Another thought appears. But now, instead of chasing the thought, the person simply notices it and returns to the breath again. In, out. With each breath, the mind settles a little more. The body begins to relax, the shoulders soften, the jaw unclenches, the breath becomes deeper and slower. Nothing dramatic has happened in the outside world, but inside, the mind has returned to a place where it can finally rest. Have you ever noticed how calm the mind becomes when attention rests fully on the present moment? When you are deeply absorbed in a simple activity, watching the ocean, listening to rain, feeling the warmth of sunlight, the mind naturally becomes quiet. Not because the thoughts have been forced away, but because awareness has returned to what is happening now. The present moment does not contain the endless stories the mind creates about time. It contains only experience, the feeling of the breath moving through the body, the sound of the room around you, the gentle rhythm of life unfolding moment by moment. In Buddhist wisdom, the breath is often described as an anchor. Just as a boat remains steady when anchored in the water, the mind becomes steady when anchored in the present moment. Thoughts may still drift by like distant clouds. Memories may briefly appear, but they no longer carry the mind away, because attention has returned home. Imagine again that quiet room at night. The person who once felt trapped in endless thinking now sits peacefully in the dim light. The same mind still produces thoughts from time to time. But something has changed. The thoughts no longer control the direction of attention. Instead, attention rests gently on the breath, on the quiet presence of the moment. And within that presence, the mind begins to experience something very simple and very profound. The present moment is enough. Nothing from the past needs to be solved here. Nothing from the future needs to be predicted here. Life is simply unfolding, one breath at a time. And when the mind finally learns to return here, again and again, something remarkable begins to happen. The endless noise of thinking slowly fades into the background, and the quiet peace that has always existed in the present moment begins to reveal itself. 11. The quiet mind is the peaceful mind. But there is one final realization that slowly emerges after everything we have explored together. Peace does not come from making life perfect. It comes from quieting the mind that is constantly reacting to life. Throughout this journey, we have gently observed the movement of the mind. We noticed how thoughts appear endlessly, how they become stories, how they replay the past and imagine the future. We saw how believing every thought can create waves of emotion, and how simply observing those thoughts can bring space and calm. And eventually, something becomes very clear. The real source of peace is not outside us. It is the quietness of the mind itself. Many people spend years searching for peace in external conditions. They believe peace will come when life becomes more stable, when problems disappear, when relationships improve, or when the future feels secure. And for a while, those things can certainly bring comfort. But if you look closely, even the most comfortable life does not guarantee a peaceful mind. A person may have a successful career, a comfortable home, and supportive relationships, yet still lie awake at night with a restless mind full of worries. Meanwhile, another person may face uncertainty and change, yet remain surprisingly calm. What makes the difference? It is not always the situation. It is the relationship with the mind. Have you ever noticed how two people can experience the same moment but feel completely different inside? One person becomes overwhelmed, while the other remains steady. One mind reacts strongly to every thought, every possibility, every imagined outcome. The other mind simply observes, allowing thoughts to come and go without becoming trapped by them. That is where the quiet strength of a peaceful mind begins to appear. Imagine again the quiet room we have returned to throughout this reflection. The same dim light, the same gentle stillness. Earlier in our journey, that room was filled with restless thinking, worries about the future, regrets about the past, endless analysis of what might happen next. But now something has changed. The room is still the same. The world outside is still uncertain. Life has not suddenly become perfect. Yet the mind sitting in that room is different. Thoughts may still appear from time to time, but they are softer now. They no longer demand immediate belief or reaction. They simply pass through awareness, like clouds drifting across the sky. And because the mind is no longer chasing every thought, something beautiful begins to unfold. A natural quietness, not the forced silence of trying to stop thinking, but the gentle stillness that appears when the mind is no longer constantly stirred by its own stories. Have you ever noticed how peaceful the mind feels when it is no longer fighting with itself? When you stop arguing with your thoughts, when you stop trying to control every possibility, when you allow life to unfold moment by moment, the mind begins to rest. Imagine standing beside a lake early in the morning before the wind begins to move. The surface of the water is perfectly still. The sky reflects clearly across the calm surface. Nothing is being forced. The stillness simply exists because nothing is disturbing the water. The mind works in the same way. Peace does not appear because we force the mind to become silent. Peace appears when the constant disturbances of thought begin to settle, when the mind no longer clings to every worry, when it no longer resists every discomfort, when it no longer believes every story it creates. And in that stillness, something very simple becomes visible: life itself. The quiet rhythm of breathing and the gentle presence of the moment, the soft awareness of being alive. This is why Buddhist wisdom often emphasizes the cultivation of a calm mind, not because calmness is an escape from life, but because a calm mind allows us to experience life more clearly. When the mind is restless, every small problem feels overwhelming. But when the mind is quiet, even difficult moments can be met with patience and understanding. A peaceful mind does not mean life is always easy. It means the mind is no longer constantly creating additional suffering. Imagine once more that quiet room at night. The person sitting there now feels the slow rhythm of their breathing. Thoughts still pass occasionally, but the mind no longer follows each one. The breath moves in, the breath moves out, and within that quiet rhythm, something deeper becomes visible. Peace was never something that needed to be created. It was always there, hidden beneath the noise of the restless mind. And when the mind finally becomes quiet enough, that peace gently reveals itself. Core message of the video. Perhaps after reflecting on everything we've explored together, a quiet realization begins to emerge. So much of our suffering does not come from life itself, but from the way the mind keeps talking about life. Earlier in this journey, we gently noticed how the mind never truly stops speaking. Thoughts appear one after another, interpreting moments, replaying memories, imagining futures that have not yet arrived. At first, those thoughts seem harmless, but slowly, they become stories. And those stories begin shaping how we feel, how we see ourselves, and how we experience the world. Yet something important becomes clearer when we step back and observe the mind with patience. Thoughts were never meant to be our enemies. They are simply movements of the mind. And the suffering begins when we unconsciously believe every thought that appears. When we follow every story the mind creates without ever pausing to question it. But the moment we begin to observe those thoughts, instead of immediately believing them, something gentle begins to change. The mind softens, the stories lose their weight, and a quiet space begins to appear between us and the endless stream of thinking. Throughout this reflection, we slowly walked through that process together. First, noticing the constant voice of the mind, then seeing how thoughts turn into stories, how those stories create emotions, and how simply observing the mind begins to loosen its grip. And perhaps now you can see something very simple, yet very profound. Peace does not come from controlling every situation in life. Peace comes when the mind is no longer constantly fighting with itself. Imagine a lake on a calm evening, just after the wind has faded. The surface of the water becomes still, and the sky reflects clearly upon it. The lake did not force itself to become calm. It simply stopped being disturbed. The mind is much the same. When we stop chasing every thought, when we stop resisting every uncomfortable feeling, the surface of the mind slowly settles on its own. And beneath that stillness, something that was always there quietly reveals itself. Peace. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because the mind is no longer creating unnecessary storms. Perhaps tonight, as the world becomes quiet and the day slowly fades, you may notice your own thoughts moving gently through the mind. Some will linger for a moment, others will pass quickly. But now, you might see them a little differently. Just thoughts, just clouds passing through the sky of awareness. And within that simple realization, the mind begins to rest. If these reflections resonated with you, you are warmly invited to share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences and insights may help someone else walking the same path of understanding. And if you would like to continue exploring calm reflections like this, you can follow Buddha's Teachings Audio, where we gently explore wisdom, mindfulness, and inner peace together. For now, thank you for spending this quiet time here, for listening, reflecting, and allowing these moments of stillness to unfold with us. May your mind grow a little calmer tonight, and may the quiet peace within you continue to deepen with each passing breath.